Mindful moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This video uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today, we're diving into Andrew Roberts Churchill, Walking with Destiny. It's considered one of the most comprehensive biographies of Winston Churchill. And, it's not just about the famous speeches and the wartime leadership.
Right. We often think of him as the stoic figure leading Britain through World War II. But Roberts paints a much more nuanced picture, starting with Churchill's early years, which were full of adventure and, honestly, a bit of recklessness.
Yeah, let's unpack this. What kind of adventures are we talking about?
Well, before he even entered politics, Churchill was a soldier, a war correspondent, even a prisoner of war during the Boer War. Roberts really highlights how these experiences shaped his worldview, his understanding of conflict, and even his leadership style later on.
That's fascinating. So it's not just that he witnessed these things, it's that he was right in the thick of it.
Exactly. And it wasn't always pretty. One story that stood out to me was about his time in Sudan. Churchill was part of a cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman, which, according to Roberts, was one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history.
Wow. That's a powerful image. I can see why that would stay with someone.
Absolutely. And Roberts argues that this experience, along with others, instilled in Churchill a deep sense of both the glory and the brutality of war, something that would later inform his decisions as a wartime leader.
And you mentioned his time as a prisoner of war. How did that experience impact him?
That's a crucial part of the story. Being captured during the Boer War forced Churchill to confront his own mortality in a very real way. He eventually escaped, a daring feat that made him a national hero. But the experience left a lasting impact. Roberts suggests it deepened his sense of destiny, fueling his ambition and his belief in his own ability to overcome seemingly impossible odds.
So even in his early life, we're already seeing these themes of resilience and a belief in his own destiny emerging. It's like these experiences were laying the groundwork for the leader he would become.
Precisely. And as Churchill transitioned from the battlefield to the political arena, these experiences would continue to inform his decisions and his approach to leadership.
So let's dive into his political journey. Roberts describes him as a maverick who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. What were some of the key moments that revealed this side of him?
Well, early in his political career, Churchill was a conservative, but he often clashed with his own party on issues like social reform and tariffs. He was a strong advocate for free trade and saw the need to address poverty and working conditions, which were often overlooked by the Conservative Party at the time. This ultimately led to a dramatic shift in his political allegiance.
He switched parties. That seems pretty bold for a rising politician.
It was a controversial move. In 1904, he crossed the floor of the House of Commons to join the Liberal Party, a move that shocked many and alienated some of his former allies, but it also demonstrated his commitment to his own beliefs and his willingness to break with tradition if it meant pursuing what he saw as the best path for his country.
That's a really interesting contrast to the image we often have of Churchill as this staunch defender of tradition.
Right, and Roberts really delves into these complexities. He shows how Churchill could be deeply traditional in some ways, but also a radical reformer in others. It was this mix of seemingly contradictory qualities that made him such a dynamic and unpredictable figure.
And this dynamic nature was certainly evident during his time as Home Secretary, a position that gave him a front row seat to some of the most pressing social issues of the day.
Absolutely. As Home Secretary, Churchill was responsible for maintaining law and order, but he also saw it as an opportunity to push for social reforms. He introduced measures to improve prison conditions, regulate working hours, and even establish a minimum wage. These were groundbreaking initiatives that showed his commitment to improving the lives of ordinary people.
So he wasn't just concerned with maintaining order. He was also aptly trying to address the underlying causes of social unrest.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that he approached these issues with a pragmatic, almost scientific mindset. Roberts describes how Churchill would visit prisons, factories, and slums to see the conditions firsthand, gathering data and speaking to people directly. It was an approach shaped by his military experience, where he learned the importance of understanding the realities on the ground before making decisions.
It seems like he was constantly seeking knowledge, always trying to learn and adapt, whether it was on the battlefield or in the halls of Parliament.
And this thirst for knowledge was coupled with an incredible work ethic. Roberts details Churchill's rigorous schedule, his late nights spent reading and writing, his constant stream of meetings and correspondence. It was this dedication that allowed him to master complex issues and develop innovative solutions.
It's clear that his early years were a period of immense growth and transformation. He was constantly pushing himself, testing his limits, and honing the skills that would later define his leadership on a global stage.
And while these early experiences were crucial in shaping the man he would become, it was his stance on the rising threat of Nazi Germany that would truly test his leadership and set the stage for his most defining moment.
This brings us to a pivotal point in Churchill's life and in world history. Stay tuned as we delve into the pre-war years and explore how Churchill's warnings about the growing danger of Nazi Germany were often met with resistance and disbelief. As we move into the 1930s, we see Churchill becoming increasingly isolated politically. He's sounding the alarm about Hitler, but many are dismissing him as a warmonger.
What's striking is how Roberts reveals the depth of Churchill's understanding of Hitler's ambitions. It wasn't just about military strength. Churchill was one of the few who grasped the ideological threat, the danger of Nazi ideology itself.
So he wasn't just worried about tanks and planes. He was worried about what was driving those tanks and planes.
Exactly. And this is where his earlier experiences, his travels, his study of history all come together. He'd seen firsthand the dangers of fanaticism and the fragility of peace. He saw the patterns repeating.
But if he understood this so clearly, why wasn't he able to convince others?
Roberts suggests several reasons. First, there was a strong desire for peace after the horrors of World War I. People were weary of conflict. Second, Churchill's personality, his bluntness, his tendency to be combative alienated some potential allies. He wasn't exactly known for his tact.
So even though he had the foresight, he lacked the political skills to build a coalition around his warnings?
To some extent, yes. But there's also a sense that Churchill was simply too far ahead of his time. He was warning about a threat that many simply couldn't imagine or were unwilling to accept.
It's almost tragic to see him fight this lonely battle knowing how right he was.
It is. But this period, the so-called wilderness years, also reveals a crucial aspect of Churchill's character, his resilience. He refused to give up to be silenced. He continued to write, to speak, to warn, even when few were listening.
And this brings us to the outbreak of World War II, a moment that would catapult Churchill to the forefront of leadership and prove his warnings tragically correct.
It's a dramatic shift in the narrative. Suddenly, the man who had been marginalized, dismissed, becomes the indispensable leader.
Roberts describes it as Churchill's hour of destiny, the moment he had been preparing for his entire life.
And it wasn't just about his experience or his knowledge of warfare. It was also about his character, his unwavering belief in Britain's ability to prevail, his sheer force of will.
So how did he approach this challenge, this immense responsibility of leading a nation at war?
He approached it with a sense of urgency, a clarity of purpose. One of the first things he did was form a war cabinet, bringing together leaders from different parties, putting aside political differences to focus on the common goal.
It's interesting how he was able to unite people in a time of crisis, despite his history of being a divisive figure.
It speaks to his ability to adapt to rise to the occasion. Roberts suggests that Churchill understood that this was a fight for survival, and he was willing to do whatever it took to win.
And of course, this is the period where his speeches become legendary, rallying the nation, inspiring hope in the face of overwhelming odds.
Yes, his words had a profound impact. Phrases like blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and we shall fight on the beaches, captured the spirit of defiance, the determination to never surrender.
But beyond the rhetoric, what were some of the key decisions he made that shaped the course of the war?
One crucial decision was to evacuate British troops from Dunkirk, a daring operation that saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers from capture. It was a military defeat, but a moral victory that demonstrated Britain's resilience.
And then there was the decision to stand alone against Nazi Germany, even after the fall of France. A decision that required incredible courage and conviction.
Yes, that was a defining moment. Churchill knew that negotiating with Hitler was futile, that appeasement had failed. He believed that Britain had a moral obligation to fight for freedom, even if it meant standing alone.
And it was during this period of isolation that he forged a crucial alliance with the United States, a partnership that would prove decisive in the Allied victory.
His relationship with President Roosevelt was complex, but ultimately they shared a common vision for a world free from tyranny.
Roberts paints a vivid picture of their wartime meetings, their debates, their disagreements, but also their mutual respect and their shared commitment to defeating Nazi Germany.
And as the war progressed, Churchill's leadership extended beyond military strategy. He was also deeply involved in shaping the post-war world, working with Roosevelt and Stalin to lay the foundations for a new international order.
This was a period of intense negotiation, of clashing ideologies, and of trying to balance competing interests. Churchill was at the center of it all, trying to steer the world towards a more peaceful and stable future.
But as the war grew to a close, a new challenge emerged: the rising power of the Soviet Union and the dawn of the Cold War.
This was a new kind of conflict, one that would test Churchill's leadership in new ways. Stay tuned as we explore the final chapter of his life, a period marked by both triumph and disappointment, but always defined by his unwavering commitment to freedom and democracy. We left off with the world on the brink of a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. Churchill, who had just led Britain to victory in World War II, now faced this entirely different challenge.
And it's fascinating how Robert shows Churchill grappling with this shift. He understood the Soviet threat, having warned about the dangers of communism for years. But he also recognized the need to avoid another global conflict, particularly with the advent of nuclear weapons.
So he's walking this tightrope between vigilance and the need for diplomacy.
Exactly, and this is where his Iron Curtain speech comes in. It was a stark warning about Soviet expansionism, a call to the West to stand firm against this new threat. But it was also a nuanced speech, one that acknowledged the need for dialogue and engagement.
It seems like a lot of people focus on the warning aspect, the Iron Curtain imagery. But you're saying there was more to it.
There was. Churchill was deeply concerned about the division of Europe, the oppression taking place in Eastern Europe. But he also believed that communication with the Soviets was essential. He didn't want a hot war. He wanted to contain the spread of communism through strength and diplomacy.
That must have been an incredibly difficult balance to strike, especially in the aftermath of such a devastating war.
It was. And Roberts explores the challenges Churchill faced during this period, both domestically and internationally. He lost the 1945 election, a surprise to many, which shows how complex the transition back to peacetime politics can be.
It's interesting how wartime leadership doesn't always translate into peacetime success.
Right. The electorate had different priorities. But Churchill didn't fade away. He continued to write to speak, to engage in the political debates of the day. And in 1951, he was back, elected prime minister for a second time.
It's amazing that he had this second act, this return to power, at a time when many would have retired from public life.
It shows his resilience, his unwavering belief in his own ability to contribute. This second term, though, was different. He was older, facing health challenges, and the world was a different place.
So how did he approach this new chapter?
He focused on stability, on rebuilding Britain's economy, and on navigating the Cold War. He continued to champion the Anglo-American alliance, seeing it as vital to global security. But he also sought ways to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union, recognizing the devastating potential of nuclear war.
It seems like his later years were marked by a deeper understanding of the complexities of peace and the fragility of international relations.
Yes, and Roberts really highlights this evolution in Churchill's thinking. He wasn't simply a warmonger, as some critics claimed. He was a pragmatist, a man who had learned from the horrors of war and was determined to prevent another global catastrophe.
This deep dive has really given me a new perspective on Churchill. It's not just about the famous speeches or the wartime heroics. It's about a life of learning, of adapting, of struggling with immense challenges, and leaving an indelible mark on history.
And that's what makes Roberts' biography so compelling. It's not just a chronological account of events. It's a nuanced portrait of a complex and fascinating man, a man who embodied both the triumphs and the tragedies of the 20th century.
If you're interested in getting a truly in-depth understanding of Winston Churchill, his life, his leadership, and his legacy, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Churchill, Walking with Destiny by Andrew Roberts. You can find a link to purchase the book in the description below. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the lives and legacies of history's most influential figures.